I'm not prepared to read out of the book because I've read it a few times already. And the idea is for somebody else to read it. But it was such an interesting way in how I got these stories that I thought I'd share that first. I've been a speaker for about 30-some years for Holocaust education. And I was a little girl, and I talked to children at school and tell them what it felt like to, from one day to the next, to have all your friends become your enemies. And what it is like to be afraid all the time. And the kids seem to understand what is involved here. So I took a lot of the stories I've heard over the years and put them together in a book to make a novel, a love story, so that it would be more digestible for young adults and older adults. I found out that there's a whole generation that has hardly any idea of this history. And I focused on the Mufti, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, because it was a rather bizarre experience. I was at the World's Fair in 1962, and coming out of the exhibit from Egypt or Arabia, and all the Middle East countries were together, and I ran into a lady from Israel, and she told me her story quite briefly. And I wish I'd had more time. I had 2 kids and a husband that wanted to go somewhere else. And I wanted to listen to her, but I did listen for a while. And she told me how she had been kidnapped from a concentration camp and taken to Berlin, to the mansion where the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a very good friend of Adolf Hitler's, was living and trying to recruit Muslim troops for the Germans to conquer North Africa. It's a history that is not that well known sometimes. And a lot of things that are happening in the Middle East right now can be traced back to the Grand Mufti. He got on the radio and started making speeches about how all the Muslim Arab people that are living in what is now Israel should leave. And because these 5 nations that were going to attack this new state would wipe it out. Well, he got them to leave. A lot of them locked their houses and took their keys and expected to go back in a few months or even a few weeks. And it didn't happen that way. So now a lot of these people are still what is in refugee camps. And the other Arab countries around them have not absorbed them. They are using them as political pawns. And it all refers back to the Grand Mufti. He was responsible for the deaths of thousands of children because he kept the convoys from leaving. The British offered, actually, the Germans to trade some prisoners of war for some Jewish children. And he stopped that. He stopped all of that because he was afraid they would go to Palestine, and he didn't want any Jewish people in Palestine. So that's the basis where I got this book. And this girl had such an interesting story. And it is bizarre, possibly unique. And I didn't think about it again for about maybe 30 years, maybe longer. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I had a dream about this whole episode. And I started sitting down and I began to write with pencil and paper and wrote out the story. And I liked the people so well that I had trouble ending it because I didn't want to leave them. And I wove the stories together of all the stories that I've heard from survivors of the Holocaust. And I think it's an educational book. I've been leaving it at libraries, and I've had some feedback from librarians who have told me that they read it in 1 or 2 sittings. And I'm not a professional writer, but I have been writing for many years. And I've done some pretty good work because I've always gotten my stuff published somewhere. So I think this is my first effort as a book. And I would like you to try and look at it, and if you have any questions, I think I will leave time for that. I have about 5 minutes, right? Does anybody have any questions about what I just mentioned? Okay, well, I think what I dealt with here was the things that different people experienced. And the epilogue tells a little bit about what happened to them later. And many people that survived did quite well. They had everything taken away from them. They had to start from scratch. I mean, they didn't even have clothes or anything from their old life. It was like it had not existed. I try to think about that. You have a life right now, and tomorrow, for instance, all the people in your town think of you as not being a person, and all your clothes in your house and everything you own is taken away, and you're just not a person anymore. You're livestock. But some of these people survived, and they thrived, and they did quite well. And I wanted to emphasize in here that too. The girls that I'm writing about, the men that I'm writing about, they recovered, and they became productive and in their lives, and well restored some of their lives, but not their old lives. They had the resources, their inner resources to do that. And we need to think about what was done, because it was not in the wilds of Africa. This was done in the civilized, the center of civilization in Europe, where people went for generations to learn about art and music and medicine and philosophy. And suddenly these people lost their moral compass. And that's pretty much what I'm trying to show too. But like I said, it's a love story, and I think we're about done, right? Yes.
What's the name of your book?
It's called To Survive Is Not Enough.
Thank you.
I guess I should have said that first. Did you have a question, dear?
Can you tell us a little bit about you started talking about you as a child and the reactions you got from your friends. What happened?
Well, I was born in Austria, and in 1938, when I was 5 years old, the Germans were jubilantly received by the Austrians and became a Nazi state, and actually became a part of Germany. It's called the Anschluss. Some of you may remember that from your history books. And from one day to the next, my family was no longer considered Austrian citizens, although my family had been there for generations. And the people that they were friends with, their hiking club, they belonged to a sports society. My mother had a very good job as a secretary in a big company that made textiles, so wholesale textiles. And from one day to the next, all of that was gone. They confiscated all the bank accounts if you were Jewish. And how did they know? Because everybody in Austria at that time had to register when they were born what religion they were. So it was right there in black and white. And they could see who everybody was. And you lost your job, you lost your friends, you were not allowed to go anywhere, and you were afraid all the time. I was not allowed to go in the park anymore. When you're 5 years old, you think, gee, what have I done to deserve this? And I think the kids can relate to that. That when you're a little kid, you think, everything refers back to you. And when people say you're bad, well, maybe you are. And that's where my background is. We finally made it to America, but I'm writing that down too. It's in another. It's a whole other version. But this is mostly historic fiction, and I did research a lot. I didn't just grab it out of the thin air. I researched the dates and what happened to these people and what the Grand Mufti had to do with it. And you all have computers, I'm sure. You can just look him up, and you'll see that he was very instrumental in everything that happened in Europe during those years.
And sharing your story with us. Thank you.
Okay.